If you watch films like Platoon and We Were Soldiers, Vietnam was all about Hueys rocking off Air Cav troopers, M60 door guns providing covering fire, and M16 toting grunts slogging through the jungle. Tanks don't even get mentioned.
In fact, armour was vitally important in Vietnam.
The South Vietnamese, the US Marines and Army all used AFVs in some of the worst tank country in the world, in ways that definitely weren't in the owner's handbook.
This is the story of armour in Vietnam.
Told through three key vehicles. It almost didn't happen at all. Following the end of French rule in 1954, Vietnam was divided along the 17th parallel between the communist north and the western-backed south. War was not long coming, and from 1962, the US Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV, was established to support the south. From March 1965, US involvement switched from advisors to full-blown intervention, with the first ground units landing at Da Nang. General Westmoreland, commander of MACV till 1968, regarded Vietnam as no place for tanks. It's easy to understand why.
Vietnam is a maze of wet and dry paddy fields, mountainous jungle and dense bamboo thickets, a strong contender for the least tank-friendly country on Earth.
If that wasn't enough, the French, fighting the Viet Minh in the Indochina War 1946-54, had made a total hash of deploying armour. Having never fought a large-scale counterinsurgency before, the French army tied themselves to the roads and conventional tactics. It was a disaster.
In June 1954, Group Mobile 100, a regiment-sized battle group strung out between An Khe and Pleiku, was repeatedly ambushed, losing 35% of its personnel and 85 of its vehicles in just 4 days.
The battle group was made up of lorried infantry and a single squadron of M5A1 Stuart light tanks, but in spite of this, it was enough to convince most of the US General Staff that when they came to fight in Vietnam, armoured vehicles would play no part whatsoever.
But they'd reckoned without the ingenuity of the US Marine Corps. The Marine Corps regarded tanks as crucial to their combat effectiveness. So, in March 1965, when they were deployed to secure Da Nang Air Base, they brought their M40A3 Pattons with them. This caused consternation in MACV, with General Maxwell D. Taylor stating that tanks were not appropriate for counterinsurgency operations. He was about to be proved wrong. The M48 was one of a series of stopgap tanks designed to fill the gap until the T-42 was ready for service. The problem was the T-42 was never ready for service. So, by the mid-1960s, the M48 is the mainstay of the US Armoured Force. Designed with the battlefields of Europe in mind, it was the US Marine Corps that insisted on bringing them to Vietnam.
Deep ditches and steep grades are no problem for the Patton 48.
The M48A3 had 110 millimetres of frontal armour, but probably more important for its service in Vietnam was the construction. It's cast, not welded, and this proved invaluable. The Communist forces regularly used improvised anti-tank mines, often made from unexploded US ordnance, and the curved underside of the M48 was effective at deflecting the blast of such devices. On top of that, the M48's 90mm main gun, plus 50 cal and M60 secondary armament, could lay down a withering field of fire, either in support of infantry in the open or in perimeter defence. It didn't take the US Marine Corps long to prove the M48's worth. In Operation Starlight in August 1965, the Marines destroyed the 1st Viet Cong Regiment on the Va Tuong Peninsula. A report on the action stated that tanks were the difference between expected heavy casualties and the light casualties we actually took. By 1966, operations like Hastings and Prairie proved that tanks and Marines working in close cooperation was the best way to destroy VC strongpoints and slash enemy supply routes in wide aggressive sweeps. Despite some continuing reluctance from MACV, tanks were proving far more useful than previously thought.
Another major challenge in Vietnam was ambush. Communist forces would create killing zones up to 1 kilometer long stretching along key highways. They planted improvised mines to disable lead vehicles and anti-personnel mines and punji spikes at the side of the road to take out infantry dismounting from trapped and stationary vehicles.
Once again, tanks proved themselves a huge asset in combating the problem. The M48s would place themselves front and rear of the convoy. The tanks at the rear would have their turrets facing aft.
If the convoy was attacked, the tanks could often ride through any initial blast, or push damaged vehicles off the road, allowing the convoy to keep moving. The armour would then cloverleaf, swinging out from front and rear to envelop the enemy. If all went to plan, they could quickly turn the tables on the attackers as their firepower came into play. Another counter-ambush tactic was the Thunder Run. A pair of Pattons would take up position either side of the road with one track on the road surface and the other on the verge. They would then race ahead of the column, hosing down likely ambush sites. If they hit a mine, it seldom did more than throw a road wheel, and if they made it through unscathed, the route was considered safe for soft-skinned vehicles to follow.
As troop numbers grew, the Army too began to deploy M48s in a fire support role, either indirect fire, a substitute for artillery, or in a direct fire role using HE against enemy bunkers.
In perimeter defence, tanks would be dug in behind an earth or sandbag berm, flanked by infantry in foxholes and with a belt of overlapping trip flares, barbed wire and claymore mines in front. From these defensive cocoons, the tanks could stand firm against human wave attacks, often with the help of one of the most controversial tank munitions ever devised, the Beehive round. The 90mm Beehive, or M580 APERST anti-personnel tracer to give it its full title, was brutal. It contained 4,200 1.5-inch 0.5-gram razor-sharp steel flechettes, along with a time fuse and bursting charge. The crew would set the detonation range anywhere from 0 to 4,300 meters. When the charge went off, the cloud of flechettes formed a 300-meter-long cone. A deadly swarm carving through jungle cover, wire emplacements, and attacking infantry with devastating effect.
The nickname Beehive came from the buzzing sound the flechettes made in flight. One M48 gunner described the round's detonation as like God fired a shotgun. Before we move on, a thank you from me for watching. And if you appreciate what we're doing as not-for-profit, please give us a like to help get this video out to a wider audience. And if you'd like to help further, click the link here to become a YouTube member. But the most numerous and arguably effective AFV on the Vietnam battlefield wasn't a tank at all.
It was this, the M113 Armoured Personnel Carrier. To the grunts on the ground, it was simply known as tracks. M113s were supplied to the South Vietnamese even before the US ground intervention began, and low on armour, the ARVN had to make use of whatever they could get their hands on. Designed to be air portable, the M113 had aluminium armour, or if you're watching this in the States, aluminum. It weighed just 12 tons, had a top speed of 42 miles per hour, was amphibious, had a crew of 2, and it could carry up to 11 infantrymen. As an armoured personnel carrier, the M113 was essentially a battle taxi, designed to drop off its passengers and perhaps provide a bit of fire support from its pintle-mounted 50 cal.
However, the ARVN hadn't read the owner's handbook. Rather than using M113s as APCs, they set about turning them into ersatz tanks. By adding extra M60 machine guns, recoilless rifles and mortars, South Vietnamese troops used M113s in an armoured assault role. To some extent this worked. The M113's mobility and amphibious capabilities were a godsend amongst the rivers, marshes and rice paddies. If a single vehicle couldn't make it through, the ARVN created daisy chains, linking multiple M113s with steel hawsers. If one got stuck, the others would pull it out.
The problem was that 38mm of aluminium wasn't enough to keep out heavy machine guns, let alone RPGs, and with the earlier M113s that were supplied to the ARVN, they were petrol driven, which meant that they burned a whole lot easier. Once they got over their initial fear of the Green Dragons, the VC realised that all they had to do was pepper the M113s with fire when they appeared, and something bad was likely to happen to the ARVN on the inside.
Multiple RPG hits would result in a penetration, while the top cover gunners were horrendously exposed to small arms fire. In a single action at Ap Back on the 2nd of January 1963, 13 were killed. With this experience, the vehicles were adapted with the creation of improvised weapon shields, later formalised as one of the most iconic vehicles of the Vietnam War, the M113 ACAV. The Armoured Cavalry Assault Vehicle had extra belly armour to protect against mines, plus beefed up side armour. The 50 cal and the additional 2 M60s all had gun shields added to protect the crew.
Suddenly the battle taxis had real teeth, and the US forces started using them in an equally aggressive manner. Perfect for reconnaissance and mobility in the open terrain of the Mekong Delta and rubber plantation. The VC had nothing to match its firepower.
At Ap Pow Bang in March of 1967, the US 1st Infantry, ambushed by Viet Cong forces, used ACAVs in a wagon wheel formation, firing in all directions to break up enemy assaults. During the iconic siege of the Marine Corps base at Khe Sanh, the ACAVs used their mobility and firepower to carve routes into the base, allowing infantry and engineer units to lift the blockade.
Not bad for a little vehicle that was essentially modified on the hoof and operating way beyond its original combat purpose.
But perhaps the strangest, and in its niche most effective vehicle on the battlefields of Vietnam, was the M50 Ontos. Ontos is the Greek word for thing, which is certainly less of a mouthful than its official title of Rifle Multiple 106mm Self-Propelled M50, but also an apt name for such an extraordinary looking vehicle.
The Marine Corps shows off its newest weapon, a speedy tank destroyer bristling with 6 powerful recoilless rifles, 4 smaller spotting rifles, and a machine gun. The Marines call it the Thing.
The Ontos are small, only 12.5 feet long and lightweight at 9.5 tons, making it easy to move by air. Yet despite its diminutive size, the Ontos bristled with 6 M40 106mm recoilless rifles with a 50 caliber spotting rifle on each side. They could fire a mixture of heat, HE or beehive rounds. For the 3-man crew, the biggest challenge was reloading. The loader was holed up in the back of the Ontos and had to exit the vehicle through a hatch and reload the 106s from the outside. Not much fun in the heat of battle. Despite this, the vehicle's combination of mobility with ferocious firepower made them devastating in the right setting. Only 300 were built, but they punched way above their weight. In Hueys City, during the 1968 Tet Offensive, US Marines stood in awe as the Ontos weaved through the tightest urban environments, knocking out walls and cutting down entire squads of enemy soldiers. Such was the reputation of the Ontos that sometimes all that was required was for a 50 cal sighting rifle round to be fired into a building, for the North Vietnamese to abandon the position. In the words of one veteran of Huey, "It was ugly, loud and dangerous. Just what we needed."
Under political pressure from home, the US started to wind down their involvement in the war from the early 1970s. MACV began the process of Vietnamization, the withdrawal of US troops and handover of kit to the ARVN.
Up to this point, tank-on-tank actions had been vanishingly rare, but with US involvement declining, and the Viet Cong having suffered huge losses in the Tet Offensive, the North Vietnamese army became increasingly involved. Now, what this meant was the war was moving from an insurgency to a more conventional phase.
Apart from a few hand-me-down T-34s, the NVA were equipped with T-54s and its Chinese copy, the Type 59. The classic T-tank, the T-54, was simple, fast and robust, with a 100mm D10T gun and up to 200mm of frontal protection. In the 1972 Easter Offensive, the first big conventional offensive of the war, the NVA used T-54s in large numbers to drive south as far as the southern city of Huangshe, and they were only stopped through the mass use of US air power. ARVN ground troops also distinguished themselves, knocking out T-54s with tow missiles and light anti-tank weapons, and ARVN crewed M48s also proved better than the NVA armour.
But these were small victories against an incoming tide. With ever-declining US support, the writing was on the wall for South Vietnam. In 1975, the North's spring offensive could not be stopped, and the South was overwhelmed.
The President therefore ordered the evacuation of all American personnel remaining in South Vietnam.
Vietnam was a war fought on camera like no other, so it's fitting that its end is defined by two images.
The first was the final airlift by helicopter from the Saigon US Embassy roof, a superpower chastened as its personnel scrambled to save themselves from the disgrace of defeat.
The other, fittingly, is an NVA T-54 tank crashing through the gates of the presidential palace on April the 30th, 1975. So, over the 10 years of US involvement in Vietnam, tanks, designed to fight other tanks on a conventional battlefield, instead proved amazingly versatile. They acted as artillery, spearheaded anti-insurgent sweeps, took on convoy escort duties, and reinforced static defences. No one expected Vietnam to be a war fought with armoured vehicles.
But in the end, they muscled their way in anyway. To our Anzac friends and supporters, we haven't forgotten the contribution made by the Royal Australian Armoured Corps with their Centurion tanks and M113s. So before submitting furious comments below, here's some good news. In February, we'll be releasing a video dedicated to the full story of the tank in Australian service. Look out for that in the coming weeks.